from wherever you are tonight. I have a few housekeeping things to go over, but first I want to thank the folks at Zero Ceiling for reaching out to us at the library to partner on this event. I'm really delighted to be a part of this, so thank you folks. And I will sort of be your moderator tonight. But before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of little details. So first of all, we have you all muted. And we'll ask you to stay muted for the duration of the session. If you have questions that you want to ask our speakers, please use the chat function. That'll be the easiest way for us to sort of handle your questions as they come in. But of course, the main content of this talk tonight will involve the questions that you have already submitted when you registered. So we will be addressing as many of the pre-submitted questions as we possibly can. And then, so we'll do that until around 6:45. And then at the end, we will have a little bit of time to address any new questions that might have come up, or if you need any clarification or anything like that. I do want to let you know that we are recording this session, but it will not be shared publicly. It will just be circulated to the folks who are registered tonight if you need to refer back to anything in the session, and we'll ask that you don't share the video with anybody when you receive it afterwards. If you are concerned about your privacy, you can leave your video off. You can use an alias for your name, which you can change by kind of hovering over your little square and right-clicking, and you can change your name there. So if you want to be Batman, you can be Batman. We don't mind. And my last little nugget of housekeeping before we start is from one of our speakers, Peter. He has asked me to emphasize that although he is a legal advocate, tonight he is not giving you legal advice. He is providing legal information, which is not the same as legal advice. So I've said it. We'll probably say it several more times tonight, but just keep in mind, this is not advice, it's just legal information. So with that, oh, and before I introduce our panelists, shall we say, I just want to thank Jill and Lizzie from Zero Ceiling, who are behind the scenes tonight, and they will be handling the technology side of things and managing the chat. So thank you, Jill. Thank you, Lizzie. Yes, I agree. They're doing great work. Okay, so we have two panelists tonight with us. We have, as I mentioned, legal advocate Peter Yates, and we have Zero Ceiling's RentSmart Educator, Sean Aston. And I am going to let them introduce themselves. So take it away, Peter and Sean.
All right. Like you said, my name is Peter Yates. I work as a legal advocate. Mainly, I represent tenants. I've worked as well as a legal representative for landlords in Ontario before coming here. So I've got a lot of years advocating for tenants and landlords. And now I'm working with Zero Ceiling to try to educate folks with rent in Whistler, so both tenants and landlords, because I've seen disputes on both sides, and I strongly believe, this is a good forum where we can actually have a discussion on certain issues that, for the most part, leads into going to the RTB, which personally I think should not be leading to the RTB, only if folks could, understand exactly what their rules and responsibilities are. So yeah, that's my background, and that's what I do. So Sean, take it over.
Great. Well, yeah, I want to really thank Peter for being here, Jeannette for facilitating, and my team at Zero Ceiling. My name is Sean Easton. I'm one of the co-executive directors at Zero Ceiling. For those of you who are not familiar with Zero Ceiling, we are a longstanding nonprofit based in Whistler, and our primary mandate is to support youth and young adults that are experiencing homelessness or facing homelessness. And our goal is to help end youth homelessness. So we do that in Whistler by providing housing and a means to work towards independence and a support system to help them along the way. And yeah, I guess how we ended up here is housing is central to the services that we provide to our participants. And over the 23 years we've been operating, we've gathered so much experience that has led us to a point now where we feel that we can extend our supports beyond the participants in our program to assist the broader community. And as we all know, that there's definitely room for growth within the Whistler rental market as far as landlords and tenants meeting eye to eye and having a great experience on both sides. So we're excited to kind of bring our experience as a nonprofit, and then also the lessons learned through becoming RentSmart educators. And yeah, just to speak a little bit about what RentSmart is. RentSmart is a program that works with landlords and tenants around like rights, responsibilities, and they talk quite a bit about the relationship between the two. And that program is offered through Ready to Rent BC, and they're all about eviction prevention as a way to prevent homelessness from happening. And so now the participants in our program, during their tenure with us, they all moved through this RentSmart course. We had our first cohort graduate a couple of months ago, and as you can see here on the infographic on the screen, this just speaks a little bit about some of the outcomes that they've seen as an organization as best practices for rental education. So yeah, we're kind of dipping our toes in tonight in offering this to the Whistler community. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. And as Sean just mentioned, we have a really good mix of tenants and landlords here tonight. So that's pretty exciting. Oh, by the way, now that we're not sharing a screen, if you just want to see the person who's speaking and not the whole Brady Bunch grid of everyone who's here, you can go up to the top right-hand corner of your Zoom screen and click on speaker view if you haven't already, or you can watch the Brady Bunch grid, you know, whatever you prefer. So we're going to get into some questions, and we have a really great mix of questions from landlords and tenants. And of course, we're here to sort of, in a way, create empathy between those two groups as well. Many people will be landlords in their lives. Many people will be tenants. And so it's important to remember to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, shall we say. So we're going to start off with one of the common themes that came up in our questions, which is around the BC Tenancy Act. And we had questions from both landlords and tenants about the situation when tenants share a space with a landlord. So rent a room in a house where their landlord lives. Do they fall under the Tenancy Act? So I'm hoping that maybe Peter can get us started by telling us what the Tenancy Act actually is and how it would apply to those situations.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So for those who don't know, the Tenancy Act, basically what that is, it's just to simplify things. It's just the law or rules that governs relationships between tenants and landlords. So if a tenant has a dispute with a landlord, Tenancy Act would apply to resolve that dispute. So everything an adjudicator at the RTB does has to come from, his power comes from the Tenancy Act. So basically it's just the law that governs, this relationship between a tenant and the landlord.
Peter, just to jump in there quickly, can you just tell everyone what the RTB is?
RTB, that's the Residential Tenancy Board. And that is where you would go and file for a dispute resolution. Dispute resolution is when, say, I failed to pay my rent because I got sick. My landlord cannot evict me without going to the board and have somebody listening to and try to adjudicate the dispute. So it's a board, a government agency that basically litigate, settle issues between tenants and landlords. What was the other part to your question?
Several people asked about the situation when a tenant is renting a room in a landlord's house. Does that fall under the Tenancy Act?
So no, it doesn't. Well, I have to say it does. However, if you are sharing, say, a bathroom and a kitchen with your landlord, typically you're not covered under the RTV, and the Act doesn't protect you. So it's one of those. Usually, what I've seen in my experience is, a young guy just graduate school and he rents a room, shares a kitchen and a bathroom with the owner, just to find out at the end that it's not covered. So unless you can prove to the board that you don't share those two items with the owner of the property, then you would be covered.
Interesting. And how about in a place like Whistler, where maybe the landlord doesn't live there full time?
If the landlord doesn't live there full time, it doesn't really matter. If the landlord shows up once a month and uses those facilities, simply because the law doesn't differentiate, is not specific as to how many times an owner uses those two amenities. As long as they use it, but for the most part, tenants, if a landlord is not using, only sleeps there once a month, they're not going to share that with the tribunal because it would work against them. But for a matter of law, if a landlord uses it, even if it's once a month, it automatically makes the tenant not covered under the RTA.
Yeah, and maybe if I can just jump in there, like I've seen this experience happen quite a few times in Whistler, and not being covered under the RTA is like, obviously you lose some protections, but when it comes down to like not having a legal lease under the RTA, there's still ways to make it work if that seems to be an ideal situation for both the landlord and the tenant. And in my experience, expectation setting at that point. So it's good because I've seen big issues is where the tenant thinks they have that protection, or the landlord thinks that it's a tenancy under the Residential Tenancy Act. So if both parties come into it knowing like, hey, like the RTA states that this circumstance wouldn't cover, like it wouldn't be covered, then it's like you just need to know that ahead of time, because the issue, a tenant might say like I'm going to take it to, like I'm going to do a dispute resolution, or so like having those expectations up front, and then it'll shift the conversation away from like having a lease agreement, which is still really valuable, to having like a different agreement where expectations are set out really clearly up front.
Oh no, you still have to have a lease agreement, regardless of if you're covered under RTA or not. You still have to have that lease agreement, because at the end of the day, that's your contract. That basically covers you. Let me backtrack. So the RTA doesn't cover you. Doesn't necessarily mean you don't have any rights. You still have rights, but you can access those rights through the small claims court, or you can go to the civil resolution tribunal for those type of disputes, not the RTA, nor the RTB. So having a lease, it's paramount. You still have to have that.
Yeah, number one. For sure.
That's very good to clarify. Now, since we're talking about leases, we have had a number of questions submitted from tenants and landlords about protocols around ending leases early. And I think in this situation, we are assuming that they are official tenants, so they fall under the Tenancy Act. Can you guys speak to from both perspectives, sort of how to go about or deal with a lease that's ending early?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Peter, maybe you get started on that.
Yeah. So you can end your lease if you want to. However, you have to understand it's a contract. once you contract once you contract to rent a property, if you decide to break that lease, there are legal consequences. I mean, there's two ways you can do. You can simply work something out with the landlord and say, hey, I don't live here for whatever reason, and I want to break my lease. Now it's up to the landlord to decide what they want to do. They can either, just agree with you and try to, get somebody else to move in. And you as a tenant, you actually also have some sort of obligation to help with that process. You cannot just walk away. I mean, you can. I've seen folks walk away from it. But if you do break it and you're a legal tenant, they could sue you, small claims court, RTV. Those are the options of the landlord, really. And another mutual break is when a tenant and the landlord both agrees to break to go different ways. However, the tenant has to help the landlord try to replace him or her. The landlord also has certain responsibilities under the law too. You have to mitigate your damages. You have to post, stuff online. You have to try to replace that tenant. At the end of the day, if you go to the RTB, they're going to ask you as a landlord, what did you do to mitigate your damages? Yes, he or she broke her lease, but did you try? If your landlord tried everything they could and, no one moved in, then they can sue the tenant for the remainder, for whatever loss, for damages, basically everything that they lost since the tenant broke that lease. But yeah, leases break all the time. It's just, it all depends on what the landlord wants to do and which route they want to take.
Yeah, and to jump in there too, like what I've seen is, especially in a place like Whistler where the vacancy rate is so low, it's hard for a landlord to state that despite their best efforts, they couldn't fill that space because housing's such short supply. And I'm sure there's that Peter has seen. And then our approach at Zero Ceiling, and in my experience, this speaks a little bit to the importance of relationships with the landlord, where like in order to get those kind of mutually agreed upon situations where both are happy to break the lease, it's like that work kind of starts well before that tenancy comes to an end. So that's maintaining a good relationship with your tenant, good relationship with your landlord. There's a good rapport there. You guys know each other, and sometimes that good rapport is just like you pay rent on time. There's no, there hasn't been any noise complaints. There hasn't been any issues. You've been a good tenant in that way. It's like, frankly, it's like from a landlord's perspective and a tenant's perspective, if you don't see each other often and there's no issues, that's usually a pretty good relationship. And then if everything's went smooth for the process of the lease, it's been my experience, if you can reach out with ample notice and help them understand your situation, that's where we get these like mutually agreed upon exits, which is win-win-win.
What about if a landlord wants to end the lease early? What happens then?
Well, yeah, a landlord can end a lease for many, many reasons. One of them is, if you breach a material fact, or which, if you breach an important part of your lease, usually is not paying your rent or causing a disturbance, disturbing your neighbors. And so if a landlord wants to break that lease, usually they have to do it legally, file with the RTB, assuming the tenant is covered. That 30 days notice. So that's what a landlord has to do. A landlord should always evict properly. If a landlord doesn't follow those rules, a tenant can then come around and sue the landlord for damages. However, like Sean said, in Whistler, I haven't seen this as much, where folks, just break their leases and leave. There aren't that many, vacant places around. But in other areas, yeah, that's a problem. Some tenants, when they lose their jobs, they just up and leave because perhaps they can find something else cheaper. But places like Whistler, tough luck finding something cheaper. Folks don't break their leases, but a landlord can, and if he does or she does, they have to do it properly to avoid being sued. There have been times when a tenant is at fault and the landlord, because he or she doesn't really know what the rules are, illegally evicts the tenant, and then the tenant goes to the RTB and the tenant wins for damages, even though the issue started with a tenant not following rules or breaking or not paying rent. So advice for tenants or for landlords, is always follow the process, and the same for tenants as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's going to be like a general takeaway from this session is like there's really clear structured processes under the Residential Tenancy Act. So, and they definitely speak to that in RentSmart, because what we see is a landlord might try to break a lease because they might claim that there's been a breach in that contract. They can't just like, you have to move out. It's just like, they might say that, but then there's a process to be followed.
Yeah.
Right? So as a tenant, and then what as tenants is, and I think Peter, me and you have discussed this before, they just pack their things and leave because they're like, man, my landlord said I had to go.
Yeah, it happens a lot. And usually when I see these disputes, I can already know the landlord didn't follow the rules, not because they chose not to, simply because folks don't know what's happening. Many people haven't read the entire RTA. Like it's, they just react out of anger, and sometimes people just don't know. If you don't know what you don't know, there's really nothing can be done about it. Landlord says to the tenant, you've got to move out, and tenant packs out and moves. So none of them follow the rules. Tenant comes to me saying I got evicted. Once you move out, you have no rights. You cannot claim any rights under the RTA. You've given up your house, and it's just that lack of access to information and not communicating sometimes.
Would you say that it's worth reading the entire Tenancy Act? I have to admit, I don't know how many pages.
Oh, you can read it. It's too long to begin with. I'm going to be honest with you.
Okay, roger that.
It's too long. No one reads the entire thing. No one reads the entire document.
Sure.
But I would say at the very least, just, know what do I have to do if I want to evict someone? It's a short paragraph. Just the basics, because those are what would cost you a lot of money down the line if you don't know. And if you're about to act, just ask. Call someone and just do a little bit of research online. Trust me, it's going to save you lots of money and headaches.
Great. Speaking of money, I have a question from a tenant, which is it legal to charge different prices in the summer and the winter if it's the same tenant staying on in your place?
Yes, it is actually. As long as it's written properly, it goes back to that contract. When you've got a contract as a tenant, as a landlord, tenants don't draw contracts for the landlord. As a landlord, you really have to be specific. These are the summer rates, and then these are the winter rates. As long as the contract has those terms and the tenant understands what he or she is signing on to, that's perfectly legal. The only time what I've seen is, a person drafts a contract with good intentions, a landlord, and tells the tenant rent is, say, $1,000. And then after 5 months, the landlord wants to evict and have it turn into an Airbnb or something that has a different rate because the season just changed. At that point, then it becomes a problem, because you cannot just change a contract without the other party's consent. If I agree into a contract with you under certain terms, those are the terms. But if you want to have two different terms, I have to know about those terms. So yes, you can have different rates, however you want to structure it. As long as you agree to it and you sign on it, that's fine. A good example of this, perhaps I'm going off topic here, but it's important. when you sign up for a credit card, most of us don't read those fine lines, and there are certain cards with high interest rate. But once you swipe that card, you consent to it. You cannot go back and say, well, I didn't know what I was signing on to. So you have to know your terms of your contract. The landlord has to make sure both terms are included, both rates, and the person has to know what they're signing on to. Yeah.
I imagine, I've never been in this scenario myself, but I could see a scenario where I asked the landlord to split the difference. You know, if it's 800 in the summer and 1,000 in the winter, can we just make it 900 year round? Does that ever happen? I mean, before you sign the contract, is there?
Yeah, you can negotiate. That's fine. But as soon as it's signed by both parties, as a landlord, you cannot go back and edit and change terms without the tenant's consent or consenting to it. Then it becomes a problem. But yeah.
Yeah. And it goes both ways too, right? Where like both parties are bound at that point. Because what I've heard from tenants is like, it's unfair. I was like, they increased the rent, and I felt like it was, it's not what I expected, but then they signed a lease, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, once again, you sign it, you're agreeing to it, right? So that, I think like your question is just a great example of that. At the start of the relationship, before paperwork signed, it's just that good communication and good expectation setting, right?
Yeah.
So
and I find I was just gonna add, and I find sometimes landlords come from a good place. You know, I'm gonna rent this place for a certain rate for a certain season, and then after that I'm gonna change that to something else. But because again, sometimes landlords don't know that you cannot switch rates without having the tenant agreeing to that, it becomes a problem. So if you're in the business of renting property, like small details like that are good to check, because it's the small ones that trips you and cause you a fortune down the line. So yeah, as long as the expectations are set and folks know what they're signing on to, you can have as many rates as you want. You can have a weekly rate, monthly rate, yearly rate. No one cares. It's a contract, 2 adults consenting to it. It's fine.
I feel like what both of you have said in answer to this question is really important for folks in Whistler who may be kind of panicked about their living situation. And it's, you know, you might just want to sign that lease without thoroughly reading it because you need a place to live. So I feel like this is a really great reminder that just take a minute. You know, if you just sign it, you don't, you know, you could be signing up for something that you didn't bargain for.
Yeah, and if it's included in that contract, and the tenant.
This recent situation where, I saw a situation where there was like a material breach in the contract, to use Peter's language. I'm definitely not giving legal advice, by the way. And where one of a subtenant moved in and they weren't actually on the lease, and the landlord used that to say there's been a material breach in the contract. There's someone in my house that isn't on the lease, which is probably legit. But then what they said is like, I'm going to breach the contract and increase rent by $500 a month, and like, take it or leave it, sign on the dotted line, or I'm going to evict you. And what they did is they just signed, and just like, well, we felt like we had no moves, or we had no say in it. We really wanted to keep our housing. Same thing, like as you said, Jeannette, kind of feeling that stress. So they ended up signing a new lease with an increased rental rate, which isn't legal, and it's far above what they're legally allowed to do. But once it was signed, it was a done deal, and we're stuck in that rate now. So, it just, once again, just talks about like, there's processes out there, right, for both parties. It's not as easy as someone saying this is going to happen, so it will. But once you sign it, you outside of these processes outlined in the act, then it's a signed contract and it's agreed upon, and you can't say anything at that point.
And just to add to what you said, Sean, if a person brings into the apartment or house somebody else who the landlord doesn't know about, that is breaching the contract. Now, if the landlord adds, say, $500, it's way above what they're allowed to do. Technically, they could argue and win that case. It's because, the contract is between you and I. Now you bring in somebody else. It's a third person to the contract.
Yeah.
Now, that's not what we agreed on. So that could go both ways. But I know what you mean. I've seen it done, and landlord just says, well, I'm going to add $800. And technically, a tenant can dispute that. However, the chances of winning are very slim.
Mm. And again, that sounds like a place where a conversation could have been had.
Exactly.
Hey, if my friend moves in, can we agree that our rent will increase by X amount?
Mm-hmm.
Could be better than suing each other.
Totally. I think subtenancies are quite common in Whistler, which is okay. But once again, you don't have the same protections, but there's ways to set those expectations up front. And under the RTA, if as a tenant you're subletting a room out to someone else, your landlord's supposed to know about it.
Oh, they have to know about it.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't know about it, that's pretty much grounds to evict you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we really advocate, like, cool, you find yourself in a situation where you can only find a sublet room, because there's share houses are super common here. It's like, make sure that you get added to the lease, or at very least, you should talk to the landlord so that they know you're there. Because what we've seen is the lead tenant just be like, it's all good, bro, move in, it's all good, wee, let's go shredding. And then the landlord's like, what? We have like 10 other people living in this house? And they just clear house.
Yeah, it happens a lot. Whistler, I've had that, 10 clients, one house, one person on the list. Landlord did not know about 9 other folks. And when she found out, she evicted everyone. They all came to me. I had to give them the bad news, saying, unfortunately, you guys are not on the list. She's right to evict. They were upset, but again, because they didn't know that a landlord has to give a written consent to have a subleaser or somebody else living in and agree to that. So yes, communication and a bit of research saves lives.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question here that might have a complicated answer, but maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'll see what you guys think. How does a Whistler landlord determine a fair rental price for their suite?
Well, that's easy. I'll let Sean take over that one.
Please.
Yeah, I think this seems better. Someone that's in economics is probably better positioned for that. But I think it's like the market will get what's demanded of it, right? So like it's got to find, like right now, I think someone asked this question. It's like the market, I think, is adjusting a little bit because the demand on housing is decreasing. But it's just like there's such a high demand for housing in Whistler that prices are higher than many places in the world. So as far as like what's fair, like what I would advocate for is not necessarily what you can, like what the market dictates, but what is reasonable when stacked up against living wage in Whistler. And also I would advocate for kind of best practices is actually set at 30% of your income, just to give you a bit of a idea. And living wage in Whistler, I believe, is set around $21 an hour for a family of 4 if both parents are making that. So it gives you a bit of a shot, gives you a bit of an idea of what you should be shooting for. That being said, I don't have the stats in front of me, but many people in Whistler pay about 50% of their income, right? And that, so as far as I would really recommend against like demanding that much money for rent. So like, just to give you some parameters of how to make some decisions there, there's like what you can get in the market versus 30% of people's income. And I think best case scenario in Whistler is like finding somewhere in the middle. So
Yep, I agree.
Do you think there's a big portion of landlords who, not necessarily maliciously, but they
Hmm.
see that other people are raising their prices and they raise them accordingly?
Um, Again, having worked on both sides,
Hmm.
I would say there's always one or two that would take advantage of that,
Hmm.
and there are those who simply don't know.
Hmm.
So it could go both ways, but for the most part, that's not the case.
Hmm. Hmm. I've heard that another kind of common issue in Whistler is folks who've purchased a home and are maybe
Hmm.
at the very top of their, like their mortgage is really at the very top of what they can afford themselves, and so
Hmm.
their rental price may be higher because they are maybe struggling to pay their own
Yeah.
mortgage. What do you think about
Hmm.
that?
There's nothing wrong with doing that.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know,
Mhm.
it's his or her property. They can
Hmm.
charge whatever they want to.
Hmm.
So I don't. I personally don't see anything wrong with it because it's his or her property. Whatever they want to charge for it, if somebody can move in at a high cost, that's fine.
Hmm.
When a landlord overcharges, I it's one of those things like it's there's really I don't really have an opinion on it.
Yeah,
It's,
well, for me,
Legal information, not legal advice.
I have an opinion because I have an opinion on everything. Um, I think a couple of different points. Just going back, like this, we're going to touch on this a lot. I think
Hmm.
yeah.
once you sign on the dotted line, it's a done
Hmm.
deal. Like you
Hmm.
Yeah.
can go and complain to your friends about how much rent you pay, but a contract's a contract's a contract. If you agree to pay 75% of your income, which is very at risk of homelessness, it's like you still agreed upon it. It might not be sustainable for you. It might not be fair, but you agreed upon it.
Hmm.
So once again, it's like don't put yourself in that situation.
Hmm.
And then I think what you touched on there, Jeannette, is a important, like maybe a bit of a lesson in empathy, because what we see, and I kind of hear it from both fair. Think, how can people charge this much money? When in fact, owning a house in Whistler is one of the most expensive places of property in the world.
Hmm.
And it's like, so people are carrying $1 million plus mortgages, like money they still owe. So their monthly mortgage payments are $6, $7, $8,000. So once you start breaking that down, you're like, okay, like they're not making tons of money, and it does actually take a lot of it, like a lot of work to and money to maintain property. And so it is, I think it is important for both parties to recognize, like, yeah, what is like a fair amount of rent, right? Because there is
Hmm.
gouging for sure, just like everywhere, not just Whistler. And
Hmm.
Yeah.
so I think that does exist, right? And but at the same time, it's like cost of living in general is quite high. Mortgages are quite high here, so it's just like trying to meet in the middle. And if it's like that rent's too high, don't sign on that dotted line.
Yes, exactly. That's what I usually would tell some of my clients. If it's too high, don't sign on it. Once you do, you have to honor that contract.
Hmm.
Um, and landlords who charge a higher price, I don't know why it's charged, why the price is that, but it's that's just capitalism. That's the economy.
That's capitalism, baby. Okay, switching gears. So we had a question come in from a tenant asking about now that cannabis is legal in Canada, can my
Mhm.
landlord still deny me the right of consuming cannabis in my rental unit? What do you guys think?
Um, I haven't really run into that as much, but just like certain establishments, you cannot smoke in it. If you go to a hotel, most hotels they don't allow smokers to smoke in those in hotels. So I think it's one of those a landlord can have grounds for, but then again, I would have to kind of look a bit more into it. If it's in your I always go back to that contract
Hmm.
to be safe. I always tell my clients or anybody, if it's in your contract and you don't agree with that contract, don't sign to it. Then again, this does not mean everything in a contract can be seen as legal, but certain things are reasonable. Like if a landlord is saying don't do cannabis for whatever reason, it could be just because they don't want to attract certain crowds. I mean, there are so many reasons as to why, even though it's legal, but they could have a good justifiable reason to not want for a tenant to do that. And if it's in a contract, to be safe, if you don't agree with your contract, just don't sign it.
Yeah,
that would be the safest thing to do.
I have a tiny bit of I looked into this a little bit when the laws changed. But I think there was a couple things. Peter's right. If it's in your lease agreement, then that gets clearly stated and you agreed upon it. But if it's not directly stated in your lease agreement and you're renting off a private landlord, I think it defaults to the laws governing cannabis use, right? And like I think it's quite easy to look up, but like they are relatively restrictive still. So it'd be important to inform yourself of that. But I also heard if it's clearly stated, say you're moving into a condo or a strata unit, like in a townhouse complex or whatever, plenty of stratas in Whistler. If it's listed within the strata rules, even if it's outside of your lease agreement with your specific landlord, that could also be grounds of it to enforce those policies. Right? So yeah, it's just good. Like once again, good questions to ask a landlord up front. If you're planning on growing or consuming, even though it's legal, there can be restrictions around it.
Yeah, I would say stay away from growing. Just, but yes, Sean, you're correct. Condos are very specific. Stratas, those the rules can trump a landlord's contract because they have to account for other tenants and other landlords. It might be a little bit relaxed in terms of if you can smoke in a house, like a private property, not a shared communal home like condominiums. So yes, again, just check your contract to be safe.
Yeah, and I guess like to dig a little bit into like maybe a practical example. Say it's not in contract and you're using within the legal kind of standards set out. It's just like this, I find we get ourselves in these dangerous situations where often people only know the Residential Tenancy Act enough to be, so they get to this point where they're like, I know my rights, and then they tell the landlord to go do something, and vice versa, right? So I think and I've actually seen this recently where somebody was using cannabis within like, their legal rights, not in their space. They were like basically walking through the hallways with paraphernalia, and they smelled like cannabis. It's hard to be inconspicuous. And some of the neighbors didn't like that. It became an issue with the landlord. So even though this person wasn't acting illegally, it created tension in their housing situation. And what I saw was the tenant falling back on that. I know my rights. Like,
so if smoking cannabis
that did not help the situation.
No, if your rights starts to infringe on other people's rights, then you may run into a problem where even if it's in your lease, you may be forced to stop doing it, especially if it's a condominium with other tenants. So if say your neighbor has an illness and you smoking in your room, it's fine, it's legal, it's your private space. But if it gets into the other unit and they start complaining, that could be grounds for you to stop doing it. So yeah, it's one of those things that it's a gray area, but again, simply asserting your rights doesn't really cover you 100% because it's the rights of the majority, especially if it's a shared place.
We are at 6:48. So
Wow.
how has this time gone so fast? But we have a couple of questions that have rolled in through the chat. So I'm going to throw those to you guys now. So Sarah asked, when it comes time to renew a lease and some of the tenants are new on the lease, can you start with a new rent amount?
Yes, because you are renewing a lease, assuming, well, that presumes your old lease is done and over with. So it's a new lease, it's a brand new contract. So yes, there's nothing wrong with that. It's up to you if you want to keep the old price or a new price. Absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Is there a limit to how much they can increase their rent, Peter?
Increase, it's a bit different with new lease, because if you are my tenant and I want to increase the lease, I want to increase the rent, I have to go with the BC amount. I think it's 2.6, if I'm not mistaken. But for a brand new lease, there is no amount. It's almost as if I just purchased my house for the first time and I want to rent it out. I can pick whatever number I want. I could go with the market price or I could go with my own number. So it's a brand new lease. It's a brand new agreement. It's up to the tenant to say, wait a second, we don't agree to this new price. And we don't want to rent here anymore. Or we sign and we continue with this new price.
And again, I guess that could be a situation where, say there are four rooms and 3 of the 4 tenants are staying on. There's only 1 new person. If you have a good relationship with the landlord, those 3 continuing people could say, hey, could we just stick to the BC allowed increase on our rent, rather than some exorbitant additional amount.
Yeah. Okay, let me see here for a sec. Old tenants, previous tenants are still living in the place, right?
Well, Sarah's question says some of the tenants are new.
Okay. So okay, perfect. Thanks for clarifying. So
no problem.
The old tenants whose lease expired, once your lease expires, you become month-to-month tenant anyway. So your old price remains. But the new tenant coming in, that person or those people's rent could be different than the old tenants because they are new tenants, you see. They are contracting with the landlord. It's a new contract. So she doesn't have to give them the same price as the previous tenants who are now month-to-month tenants. So yeah, they would absolutely, it's up to the landlord to either have old prices or new prices for the old tenants, for the new tenants, not the old tenants.
Not the old tenants. Okay, gotcha. Sean, go for it.
And Peter, jump in here, but because I think there's a co-tenancy where each tenant has a lease agreement with the landlord. So it might be one lease agreement, but they all sign onto it as a co-tenancy. And then often the case in Whistler is there's I think sole tenancy where one person is the lead tenant, which is often desired by landlords because they don't want to deal with 6 different people in a big share house. So at that point, even especially if the landlord has agreed to a subletting arrangement under a sole tenancy, I think it could be challenging for that landlord to increase rent with new subtenants coming in. So I think that it's one of those things where there's some decisions to be made, especially if you know the nature of your house. If you have a big share house, co-tenancy might be the way to go. So you have a bit more flexibility how to manage those rents as people come and go. But if you want the ease of having just one person to deal with, it might restrict you from increasing, just drafting new lease agreements every year. And I think, and Peter, once again, jump in if I'm wrong. I think nowadays, leases will just roll over into month to month unless you have them as fixed term. And I believe it's even become restrictive. You can only kind of tick the fixed term box if there's a reason that you're going to be asking these tenants to leave. So if you're month to month, same thing. You can only increase rent by the legislated amount.
Yeah. If you're month to month, absolutely.
Mhm.
Um, for a new tenant coming in, they are not a month to month. It's a new person. It's a new agreement. But yeah.
Mhm. So we have a question here. I really like the wording. um, what are your opinions on landlords being expected to offer rent discounts to tenants at the start of the pandemic?
What are my opinions or our opinions on landlords offering rent discounts to tenants?
Mm-hmm.
I would say do not offer a discount. No, I'm joking. Just kidding. Um, it's up to the landlord. This really, I don't have an opinion. It's not legally required,
Mm-hmm.
but if a landlord wants to do that, that's fine. I mean, morally speaking, perhaps it's good. You're helping out a tenant, uh, but it's not a requirement. So
Mm-hmm.
it's go both ways for me. I don't know about Sean. What do you think?
I've spoken with landlords that decided to do that, and I think they just did their due diligence and put it in writing, and just
Mm-hmm.
like, and those landlords I spoke to, they're just like, they kind of looked at it as like, this is a way I can help people, and
Yeah.
these specific landlords were forecasting changes in the rental market, so they're like,
Yeah.
I have good tenants now, things might change into the future, I want to keep these good tenants.
Okay.
So it was a bit of a sign of good faith to keep good tenants into the future,
Mm-hmm.
as we're starting to see a little bit now, more places become.
Mm-hmm. If I were to add to that, I would say absolutely. If it's a discount, you've got to make sure it's written in the contract for how long, how much, and when the full rent starts. Because if it's not clear, first month, if rent was supposed to be 1,500, you give me a discount for 500, and I pay 1,000. Um, a person can misconstrue that to be the actual rent, and if it's not in the contract, there goes more conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's a discount, you've got to specify that in your lease agreement.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. All right, I have a question here about short-term rentals. So, can a landlord rent monthly for, say, 2 or 3 months during the off-season with a short-term lease, and then switch to nightly rentals during the high season without the tenant having any dispute about ending that short-term rental?
Mm, I think we somewhat touched on that already. Yes, it's absolutely okay to do, but you've got to make sure it's in the contract. All those terms are like written down, and the tenant moving in understands what those terms are. It's not acceptable if a tenant moves in thinking it's long term and then it moves to nightly rates or whatever rates that is. Then it's going to become a problem because a landlord cannot change a contract that I've agreed to. So as long as those terms are written down,
Mm-hmm.
it's fine.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, of course, if your property is actually zoned for nightly rentals, right?
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
if zoning is if you're in an area where zoning dictate that, then yes, you've got to
Mm-hmm.
follow municipal rules as
Mm-hmm.
well. So yes. But okay, so if zoning says you cannot have it as a monthly property where you rent monthly, only nightly,
Mm.
then you should have never be doing a monthly rent to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I didn't even know that was another category.
uh, yes, some cities, some towns have different
Okay.
rules.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but generally speaking, what I know is if the town makes it okay,
Mm-hmm.
if there are no zoning conflicts,
Mm-hmm.
a landlord can have multiple rates, can have daytime rates, night rates, weekly rates,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter as long as both parties understand what
Gotcha.
the lease / contract is all about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think like just in that um, interest of being informed, and I'm not a zoning expert, but there's definitely like, I know Whistler is taking an approach of you can only do nightly rentals through Airbnb, for instance, if
Mm-hmm.
you are zoned to do so. So there's really specific. Um, And then there's also zoning in Whistler that's employee restricted zoning, not just the WHA housing, but it's also built into just some general zoning around town. I know Bay Shores has some, for instance. So at that point, like, you can assume if you have that zoning, you're not going to be zoned for nightly rental either. So, and then like we're all aware of the fact that, yeah, people don't necessarily follow the law super closely. So it's a risk that you'd be taking if you are renting, doing nightly rental where it's not zoned. I don't know how much it impacts lease agreements. And once again, it's like, do your due diligence as a landlord and a tenant, that you have a good lease agreement. And then I think it becomes a municipal enforcement issue if people are doing the nightly rental when they shouldn't be.
Yeah. Because if it's not, if you as a landlord don't follow the zoning rules, and you change the rates, and then a tenant finds out, they can successfully challenge that and win, possibly. Very likely the tribunal will probably have to side with them, because you have this theory in law which is called clean hand theory. So you cannot try to reinforce something if your hands are not clean. If my contract is not if my contract doesn't fall, if while drafting my contract, I did not follow the law or the rules, while doing it, I broke some law, it's going to be hard for me to ask an adjudicator to reinforce that contract, regardless if I'm coming from a good place or not. So if zoning is an issue, just stick to what the zoning allows you to do. But if zoning is not an issue, you can absolutely have multiple rates.
Well, it's 7 o'clock. I'm going to ask you guys one more question from the chat, because it's a very modern question, and I'm curious if you've heard this before. And I'm curious how much this is going on in Whistler. This question asks, as a landlord, I almost never do a contract with my tenants. We have the terms in writing via text message. Could these terms in our text messages supersede RTB regulations?
Supersede. Okay, so you can have an oral contract. The only issue is not having a written contract. It becomes a problem. It becomes a bit hard to reinforce when you have a dispute. Members, judges, and whoever who mediate disputes, it makes their jobs easier when they've got a contract to refer to. When you have just text messages, they will use that, because an agreement is an agreement, regardless in what form it comes in. But supersede the RTB, no, it's not. It just gives a roadmap of what you two agreed on. But it's a good idea to have a contract. And contract doesn't necessarily have to be 5 pages. It could simply be half a page. As long as it's written down, and as long as it covers certain basic rules of the relationship. So do I have a problem with folks not having contracts? Not really. But in this atmosphere, like in this arena of renter landlords, it's always a good idea to have a basic written contract. Because text messages, I can simply argue, well, I never received a text, so I lost my phone. So if I lose my phone, now the RTB may not have, most likely they're not going to rely on those text messages from the landlord. If a tenant claims, I don't have my text messages anymore. I mean, it gets murky. So contract is always a good idea for me.
Yeah, I would say it's probably not great practice from both angles. Like, I, in large part, support tenants, but have lots of conversations with landlords. We run this program. We're part of this program called the Friendly Landlord Network. So we work quite closely with landlords through that. And I would say landlords and tenants are putting themselves at risk if the agreement is verbal or over text. As we all know, we misinterpret text all the time. So it's like a text lease agreement can very easily be misinterpreted. And for that reason, I think, as Peter was saying, trickier to enforce. What I really recommend is, I believe the RTB has a really good template. Like they have a form for lease agreements. They're great. Fill in the blank, Mad Lib style. Can't go wrong. And it's like, that is the best practice. And there's room to add additional clauses for whatever reason. If there's like noise restrictions, or you don't want cannabis use in common areas, whatever, so that there's room for those things to be stipulated. I typically would, in supporting a tenant, would recommend not agreeing over text. And out front, and what we coach through the RentSmart program is like, you could bring one of these templates, one of these forms, if they don't have a really solid contract offer. And I don't think it's typically not out of maliciousness. They're just like, yeah, this is the Whistler norm. It's all good. I've never had issues with this. But it's like,
this could be the time you do have issues.
Oh yeah.
The result of misunderstandings, because there's not clear expectations and there's no documentation to back it up. Right. So just that, and that's the nice thing about that form is like, it's a nice clean form, but it forces you to set expectations. You sit down and set expectations with each other.
And just to add, it protects landlords as well, because I would say almost every tenant is a good tenant. There's always that one tenant who's not a good tenant. And if you run into that person, they may exploit that. And if you only have a text or text messages, and there are no rules that prohibits a person from doing certain things, they can absolutely do those and then say, well, we don't have a contract, and two, it's not in our text messages, you see. Then you're pretty much stuck as a landlord. So it protects both parties, tenants and landlords. It's just a good practice. I've seen many disputes coming from not having a contract. It gets messy.
Yeah. And just like to back up, like on like some of the processes we referenced a little bit, like for ending a tenancy, basically, I think it's changed a little bit because of COVID, but like it's not appropriate to do it over email or text. It needs to be in person or in writing. So we can assume based on that, for instance, that like text probably won't be super enforceable. So
well, if you're a landlord, absolutely, you cannot end a tenancy without having that form from the RTB anyway. Ending a tenancy, even if your contract was just text messages, but if you want to end that tenancy, you have to go to the RTB site, download the proper form, and serve it on to the tenant. So.
Well, folks, it's past 7 o'clock, so we'll start wrapping up here. Jill has let me know that if there are any unanswered questions at the end of the chat, Zero Ceiling is going to do a wrap-up post on their website, and they're going to recap what we discussed tonight, and they will reach out to you folks individually if you have unanswered questions with a little bit of guidance where they can. And of course, as you know, we'll also be sending out this recording to you as well. Oh, and Jill has very helpfully posted that RTA template in the chat window. So if you want to open that link, you can find that template right now. Before we say goodbye, Peter and Sean, do you have any final pearls of wisdom, not advice? Any final words of wisdom about renting in Whistler for tenants, for landlords, for everybody? What would you like to?
For me, I would say just make sure you have everything in your contract as a landlord, and as a tenant, make sure you understand what you're signing on to. And sometimes, even if you have it, even if you've got a contract and something goes wrong, usually I find many disputes that I resolve for tenants and landlords is simply communication. Just talk to the other person. Quickly going to file a dispute resolution complaint with the RTB. Yes, that's what the law requires you to do, but it just makes things worse. sometimes being diplomatic, it's good. That's what I've always advocated. And when there's a dispute, I always tell my clients, tenants usually, just talk to the landlord, and landlords talk to the tenant. You'll be surprised. Just that basic discussion can save you time, money, and stress. And if you're a landlord, you want money for a property if it's a good tenant, and it's one-off mistake. Just correcting that is better than going to the RTB. So yeah, just have a contract, both sides, understand what's happening with it, and should things fall apart, just have a chat.
Sean?
Yeah, to add to that, like I'm all about relationship. So build that relationship up front. It's a very important relationship both with the landlord and the tenant. One represents income, the other represents your housing. So invest in that relationship up front, and you can help mitigate these challenges from even happening into the future. And then because you've invested in that relationship early, when challenges do arise, which can happen, you can resolve them before going to the residential tenancy board. So I'd say like treat each other like people, and with respect, and it goes a long way. And then just know that there's help out there beyond the Whistler Winter and Whistler Summer page. So that's what we're trying to do with this discussion, is communicate that out, and we want to give some good information so we can make this market still friendlier for everyone.
Yeah. And we're going to be doing this often, right, Sean?
Yeah, sure. we're gonna be doing more. This is just us getting started. It's in development, so we hope that we'll be coming back at you guys in ahead of the winter season really kicking off. So
awesome. Well, I will say thank you to everybody who attended tonight. Thank you to Sean and Peter for sharing so much great information. Thank you to Lizzie and Jill behind the scenes. Sean, do you want to mention, I know Zero Ceiling has a fundraiser coming up. Would you like to mention that to the fine people at home?
Yeah, maybe I'll let Lizzie mention that.
Oh, sure. Yes, Lizzie, jump in.
Hi, everyone. I will jump in just really quickly to let you know that our fundraiser is coming up on Saturday, October 3rd. It's called Family Dinner, and we are offering a delicious meal box cooked by some of the chefs at the Hilton, Whistler Cooks, Milestones, and the Squamish Little Cultural Centre, for you to pick up and enjoy at home with your family, and then come and join us online for a quick half hour of stories from our programs and what's been happening at Zero Ceiling this year. So head over to our website at zeroceiling.org, and you can buy your tickets now. We would love to see all of you there.
Awesome.
Nice. Before we sign off, Zero Ceiling is actually looking for new landlords as well. So yeah, if anyone is interested, we're putting our feelers out there into the universe right now, but feel free to get in contact with us through our website as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, and everyone will hear from Jill or from a member of the Zero Ceiling team with a follow-up. So thanks for coming, everybody. I think that's all she wrote.